Okay. All the participants are requested to come up to the occasion. We are now going to start the first technical session of the day. Those who are not done with their teas can bring their tea along with them. Now it is time for our first technical session, that is on federalism in times of crisis. This technical session will be chaired by Wilfried Swenden and co-chaired by Carlo Basta.
Thank you very much, everyone. In the interest of time, the role of the chair is simply to introduce the speakers and also to make sure that they keep to what we've been asked, and they're going to try that. They were asked to present in 15 minutes. They will try to do it in 10 minutes if possible. So a lot of the presentations, unfortunately, in this panel, but still better than not to have them, will be online. The first speaker will be Søren Kiel, who is presenting a joint paper with Hanns-Seidel-Stiftung from the University of Bergen. Søren is a part of the University Center for Federalism at the University of Fribourg, and he will present, or they will present, on legitimate crisis management in multi-level systems, evidence from European democracies. After that, we move on to a paper by Johanna Schnabel, who is at the University of Berlin, and Yvonne Hegeler on intergovernmental councils and crisis management, coordinating responses to COVID-19 in federal states. And this is followed by a paper by Henrik Scheller, who also is based in Germany, but at the German Institute of Urban Affairs in Berlin, who will present on federal corona crisis management in Germany between the federal government's coordination of European policies and the implementation in the municipalities. And then last but not least, we have Elisabeth Alber, who is here in person and who will present a joint paper with Günther Palaver and Alice Engel. All are based at the Eurac Research Institute at Bolzano, but in different sections for it, some on comparative federalism, others on minority rights. And they will talk about crisis management in the context of COVID, but also beyond, multi-level crisis management in European border areas. So each of them will present for 10 minutes. We'll take Q&A afterwards. My colleague and friend Carlo Basta is co-chairing the session, and he will kind of lead on the Q&A after the presentations. So without further ado, I hand over now to Søren and Schakel for their paper on legitimate crisis management in multi-level systems.
Thank you very much, Wilfried. I would have loved to be with you in India. It was not meant to be, so here we are. What I would like to present to you is the beginning of a large research project that is called LEGITIMULT, Legitimate Crisis Governance in Multi-Level Systems, which examines the effect of particularly the COVID-19 crisis on multi-level systems in Europe. And when I say multi-level systems, I'm referring to literally all European states, because in one way or another, they are all multi-level systems. They are, of course, not all federal, but they are all multi-level systems. Please allow me to share my screen with you. So the LEGITIMULT project is funded under the EU's Horizon Europe scheme. And the project started in October. So what I want to present with you is kind of a framework for the analysis of crisis governance, and particularly the question of legitimacy. At this stage in the research, being about 3 months in of a 3-year project, you will see there is more questions than there is answers. But I think one of the things Arjan and I have tried to do is to look a little bit about what are the variables we are interested in when we want to understand legitimate crisis governance. And this is particularly important because Arjan is working on a massive data set where he will look at the impact of legitimate crisis governance and general crisis governance in Europe in different multi-level systems, looking at what local, regional, national, European, and international decisions have been taken in the crisis governance. So without further ado, let me say kind of what are the 3 aims. Well, one is think about this idea of legitimacy. The second one, as I've just mentioned, is to think about what are some of the variables one would look at. And what are the key areas one would want to study. And this all kind of needs to be seen in the light of what are the key objectives of the LEGITIMULT project. And these are to understand how has COVID-19 and its measures affected democratic governance. What role do multi-level governance institutions play in COVID-19 measures? And thirdly, to think about how could legitimate crisis governance look in the future, taking into account that the next crisis is just about around the corner, whether it is Ukraine, whether it is a climate crisis, whether it is a food crisis that is happening in many countries. Certainly the question of how will crisis governance look like, and particularly how will legitimate crisis governance look like, will remain very prominent. This is the key research question of the LEGITIMULT project. It's a question of what makes legitimate crisis governance. And the research question comes from the point where we started saying, actually, we know very little about legitimacy in crisis governance. We know quite a lot about legitimacy in normal times. There are different ways of how one can measure legitimacy. I've given you here the World Bank good governance indicators that some people would say they are kind of the symbol of legitimacy, right? There are other ways how to measure legitimacy. There are specific legitimacy indexes you can find. But when you think about legitimacy in crisis governance, it becomes a lot more complicated. And the key issue here is that everybody is in agreement that legitimacy in crisis governance is probably very different from legitimacy in normal, non-crisis times. But how different? And when does legitimacy stop being legitimate? When does it turn into illegitimate decisions? And finding that out and thinking about a framework is kind of at the heart of the LEGITIMULT project. So when we look at the project and when we think about the kind of variables that make up legitimate crisis governance, there is a number of things to consider. The first thing is terminology. Is legitimacy the same as good governance? Right? The key is how do you define legitimacy? Johanna, Elisabeth will know that from ongoing discussions we have in the LEGITIMULT consortium. Of course, legitimacy has different perspectives, right? There is the institutional legitimacy. Is a proper institutional framework followed? Is the rule of law implemented? Right? Are the principles of proportionality, for example, met? Do people have access to challenge a decision in court, etc., etc.? And then there is a question of perceived legitimacy. So those that have to deal with the decision, do they perceive it as legitimate? Do they perceive the decision, the actors, and the process the decision was taken as a legitimate decision? And what makes LEGITIMULT, from my perspective, more interesting and more fascinating is that on top of this complex understanding of legitimacy in crisis situation, we add the multi-level dimension. Right? So does it matter if a decision is taken by a local, regional, or national level, or even by an EU or by an international level? Does that make a difference for the way how legitimacy is perceived by the people who have to live with the decision? Does it make a difference in terms of specific areas? For example, are you willing to accept limitations to your fundamental rights more if it comes from a local or regional level than from a national or, let's say, European level? Right? So this is a key element where LEGITIMULT tries to make a contribution. So how do you measure legitimacy? And this is kind of the first discussions we've had with Arjan on what are the things we are interested in. Well, of course, you can look at the legitimacy of measures, right? Do we have a form of output legitimacy? Is there legitimacy in the measures that were taken during the COVID-19 crisis? That is really hard to measure, right? Because it also depends on, well, how legitimate is a measure that, for example, tells people to stay at home or to wear masks? Legitimate in the face of what? You can look at legitimacy of the actors. Was this taken by democratic elites? Did this follow a proper democratic decision-making framework? Right? If it wasn't taken through the proper democratic decision-making framework, what was the legal basis of any decision-making? Was it emergency provisions? Was it pandemic laws? Was it intergovernmental negotiations? We see all kinds of different evidence in Europe here. When we look at actors, of course, in the COVID-19 crisis, the role of task force and expert opinions becomes very important. Right? These are non-democratic actors that became vital. In some countries, they were the ones drafting legislation and decisions. What about the process? What process was followed? Was there a process? And if so, was the process always followed? Which limitations were there to the process? Right? Which limitations were there to an ordinary legislative process? Did the parliament not meet? What about constitutional courts, right? If you look at Switzerland, the question of referenda became really, really important at the beginning of the corona crisis. Then the legitimacy of the perception. So how do people feel about the decision? Do they think it's a legitimate decision? Right? At the beginning of the lockdown, probably most people in Europe would have said a lockdown is perceived as legitimate because COVID-19 is seen as a dangerous decision. Right? If a lockdown would happen in Europe today, it would probably not be perceived as legitimate anymore. The logic would be, right now, this is not the right response, no matter if it follows a democratic process and if it finds the majority in parliament. The legitimacy of decision implementation. Making a decision is one thing. How do you implement it? This is particularly important when you look at decisions that are sometimes taken knowing you can't implement them. Very famous example here is the British decision to allow people only outside for 1 hour. During the first lockdown, people in the UK were only allowed to go outside for exercise and recreational purposes for 1 hour. Now that's the kind of decision you cannot enforce. How do you enforce that, right? So already the decision becomes questionable because you know you can't fully implement it. Are you going to control everyone when they've left their house, right? And then also, as I've just said, the question of legitimacy over time. What might have seemed legitimate at one point in time does not necessarily seem legitimate later. And we see that, for example, in many European countries with more challenges to lockdowns, more challenges, more disobedience towards mask wearing, etc. This is a fantastic graph of the legitimate framework. Right? Very important. Always have a really complicated graph to pretend you know a lot. So in a nutshell, I'm not going to talk you through all the details, but in a nutshell, what LEGITIMULT does is it looks at the different measures taken to cope with COVID-19. This is done in our first work package. This is what Arjan and his team do. Really trying to map out what do national, regional, and selected local levels do. What did they do during the COVID crisis, including also the EU level plus the WTO recommendations. These decisions are then being analyzed through different work packages that look at thematic focus points, such as the rule of law and democratic participation, human and minority rights, the issue of trust, so the perceived dimension of legitimacy, and the issue of economic sustainability. And that then all leads to a situation where you have to look at different trade-offs. And that's really where legitimacy comes in crisis governance, right? In crisis governance, it is all about really the box you see here on the bottom. It's all about trade-offs, right? What trade-offs are acceptable, what trade-offs are not acceptable, okay? So, where do we go from here? Well, we're still trying to wrap our head around how do we measure legitimacy. We're still this is kind of the first framework to think about what variables do we need. The next step is then to think about the trade-off. How do we actually measure the different trade-offs that were being made? And then you always have to keep in mind the multi-level governance perspective. And out of that, hopefully in about 2.5 years, comes a framework that tells us a bit more about how legitimate crisis governance could look like in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Søren, for setting the scene. We move on to one aspect which is also important in terms of generating legitimacy, and that's the operation of intergovernmental councils and crisis management. And Johanna Schnabel and Yvonne Hegele from the Freie University in Berlin and the Zurich University of Applied Sciences respectively will enlighten us on that particular issue. So I think it's Johanna who will present. So Johanna, you have the floor for 10 minutes if possible.